Hello. Hi, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. Let me just get set up and then share my screen. Okay, so we are discussing culture. It is the second chapter of your textbook, I believe, if I'm incorrect, whatever. But it is a chapter in your textbook. So to get started, you kind of need a basic definition of culture here. So I have multiple definitions going through it. The first one that I have is that culture is the language, beliefs, values, norms, behaviors, and even material objects that characterize a group and are passed from one generation to the next. I like that this definition kind of highlights the aspects of culture or the elements to culture, meaning language, beliefs, values, and norms here that kind of are very, very important to this definition, as well as highlighting the material aspect of culture, that it can be material and non-material here, which I'll get into in a second, and what exactly that looks like and means. Another definition that I have here is that culture is shared, socially learned knowledge and patterns of behavior characteristic of some group of people. This definition highlights as well how culture can be shared among groups of people and kind of like passed down as well. So generation to generation, as you know, we might pass down objects through our family lineage, but we also, and genetics, but we also pass down certain cultural practices as well here. And so that's what this definition is hinting at. Um, as well as patterns of behavior and how these patterns of behaviors might emerge out of a specific culture or subculture here. Patterns of behavior can be really anything. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we function on a day-to-day basis. It's what we do. It's how we speak, maybe our speech patterns. That can all be found within a cultural subgroup or a group. And then anthropologists often use the term culture to emphasize the unique or most distinctive aspects of people's customs and beliefs. There are some key features of culture. Um, the first one being that it is learned. So it's learned, culture is learned, as well as shared among members. And then the third one is responsible for most differences in ways of thinking and behaving that exist between human societies and groups. So culture is what makes us unique, and oftentimes it's that uniqueness that kind of makes us distinct from one another, as well as somewhat similar from one another, as I highlighted in the last video. Um, is and then the last one to note here is that culture is so essential in completing the psychological and social development of individuals that a person who does not learn some culture would not be considered normal by others. Which that is also getting at those who fit in within a culture and those who kind of fall outside of a culture or might appear to be for example, you have the norm or the abnorm, right? And so you end up labeling people through that process and whether or not they fit in with a particular culture or whether or not they do not fit in with that particular culture and they further feel isolated. There are multiple hidden parts of culture, and so some parts of culture are pretty obvious, and they're easy to study, in other words. And they're further for sociologists and anthropologists, they're easy to observe within group behavior. So the elements to culture that are pretty easy to observe here are language, folklores, stories, right? Reading those stories and historical stories, fine arts, analyzing different types of arts within different cultures and subcultures, holidays and festivals, and analyzing what those practices look like, what those rituals or rites look like within those particular festivals or holidays. Literature coincides with folklore here. Dress, how we dress and how that can be culturally tied, as well as food practices, what we eat, what our nutrition is, and how foods differ from culture to culture, from region to region. And foods have differed from one generation to the next generation. And other parts of culture are a lot harder to see and look at, especially if you're an outsider looking into a particular culture. So sometimes it's helpful to become an insider to kind of unravel the different parts of culture that are otherwise, they would be otherwise too difficult to see. And so to do that, you would embed yourself within that particular culture. And some aspects that might be difficult to know unless you're an insider would be certain attitudes or feelings, right? Certain biases or core values. Some family roles might be difficult to fully grasp unless you embed yourself within that culture, or beliefs, assumptions, um, beauty ideals, family values, gender roles, cleanliness, modesty, and notions of modesty might be difficult here. Work ethic, child rearing practices, all of this would take more time to look at with a particular culture. So there are different types of culture here. There are two particular types that are important to note. You have material culture and non-material culture. Material culture is simply the material objects that distinguish a group of people, such as their art, buildings, weapons, utensils, machines, hairstyles, clothing, jewelry, day-to-day accessories, in other words, or items that they surround themselves with that represent them, their identity, and their culture, right? It's physical, it's tangible items that most of the time people can either hold or they own, or they have ownership over that. And it somehow represents their identity and their tied identity to their culture. Um, on the flip side, you have non-material culture. This is a group's way of thinking, its beliefs, values, other assumptions about the world and doing. It also is common patterns of behavior, including language, gestures, and other forms of interaction that might arise out of a group, and might also be culturally tied, right? And so, for example, material would be a particular piece of jewelry that represents a culture's religion, right? And a person might wear that and might feel very, very strongly tied to that piece of jewelry. That would be material culture. An example of non-material culture would be maybe a gesture that they do in the process of prayer, right? They might hold their hands a particular way, or bend a knee a particular way, or sit a particular way. And they might further communicate to other members of whatever religion that they're a part of in a particular way through a particular language. They might have specific terms associated with different rituals that they practice within their particular religion, right? And they might even have specific festivals and holidays they also further might practice and continue to practice. So that's just some examples of it. So so this is getting further into behavior, which is a big part of culture here, and it's a big part of non-material culture as opposed to material culture because it's a less tangible. You can't really hold a behavior. That would be very difficult to do, if not impossible to do. So an analogy with language will help clarify why this distinction matters. All the knowledge, information you have in your head about how to communicate by talking is language, in other words. What you actually say or talk about in particular situations is speech. That's where we get our speech patterns in us, or certain tones that we might use. And those tones are also culturally tied. Because you might have one group that talks rather fast when they speak, while you might see another group talk rather slow, or talk at a heightened pitch or a lower pitch, right? And that tends to be picked up by other members of that particular group. And it's further passed down through generations and how they learn their mother tongue, in other words. Cultural knowledge here is an important term. It includes all information about the world and society that children and adults learn to apply to their own lives and in their own lives. And this is cultural knowledge that is very difficult for someone coming into a culture to pick up on. That's why you need ethnographic, for example, ethnographic research that a lot of anthropologists do. Stated differently, that's why you see a lot of anthropologists and sociologists embed themselves into a particular culture because they don't necessarily know every aspect of cultural knowledge there. They need to learn it because they didn't grow up with it. Behavior includes, so first and foremost, behavior is habitual. It's done regularly and over and over and over again to a point where you don't even recognize that you're doing particular behaviors, right? And you don't even recognize that those behaviors are further culturally tied because you grew up with them. And so a lot of it is just you starting to re-recognize those behaviors or those habitual behavior patterns. It's also something where it's the learning process. Again, that's part of culture, where you do something over and over and over again until it becomes a habit and until you don't have to think about doing it. You just do it. Again, so it's habitual, behavior is regular, and then people can adopt very similar behaviors, especially in subgroups and major groups here. And this is, for example, this is seen in different cliques in high school, right? Where you tend to pick up the behaviors of your friends and your best friends, and you tend to start to joke about stuff and find stuff that's funny the same way that they do, right? And you find very similar interests among certain people, like your best friends, and you laugh about very similar at very similar jokes and memes and the like. That all becomes behavioral patterns that are picked up within a specific group. And that's just one example of this, but this is seen continuously within specific groups. Like, for example, another example here would be so sociologists and criminologists who study gang violence also see pattern behavior that is picked up within that specific group, where they again learn how to commit certain crimes through other members. And that's something that's taught over and over and over again, where it almost becomes habitual. And they do it on a regular basis, again, within that specific subgroup. That's just another example that would easily apply here as well with understanding behavior. So patterns of behavior is another important term within culture. and different subgroups as well. It is within a single culture, the behavior most people perform when they are in certain culturally defined situations. These patterns of behaviors, again, are habitual. They are picked up over and over again. You learn them, in other words. A good example of this is there's a ton of research done by anthropologists and sociologists looking at gender roles, and what specific people do in a marriage setting and a relationship setting. And there's a specific pattern of behavior that might occur within that process. A good example of this are dating rituals. Those are patterns of behaviors where you see, historically speaking, men buying flowers for women. That's not a sex thing. That's a pattern behavior thing learned within a culture where culture teaches men to buy flowers for women, because that's a dating ritual or a process, in other words. And that's tied to gender roles for a specific culture. That's just one example of pattern behaviors here that you might see arise within a particular culture. There are different attitudes, behaviors, and mannerisms that we also tend to pick up from other people around us. And when you're in the same culture as other people, you tend to use the same mannerisms and gestures and behaviors. But when an outsider comes in contact with these attitudes, behaviors, and mannerisms, and they don't know what they mean, they might interpret them wrong. And oftentimes that is seen. For example, the thumbs up doesn't always mean good job from culture to culture. It might be something negative. It might be similar to flipping someone off in a different culture. And so it's important to also have that insider knowledge in what those mannerisms look like, what those gestures look like, how your gestures or my gestures might be culturally tied. Same with eye contact is something that differs from culture to culture. Certain cultures, you can't use a lot of eye contact because it's considered rude, while other cultures, you have to maintain eye contact. Smiling or being sad or having certain expressions might be normalized in certain settings, while not normalized in other settings. For example, you don't, I hope you don't often see people smiling at a funeral. Usually you see them crying or being sad in their facial expressions. Versus, I mean, you might see someone super happy at their birthday party because it's their birthday, right? And so certain mannerisms and attitudes are designated to certain social settings. And that's also seen and studied as well by sociologists and anthropologists. Okay, this is kind of reviewing everything that I discussed in the previous slides. But again, culture is collective. It's shared among groups of people. And it's even shared beyond that group, where other groups can appreciate or take on different elements of culture. And they might take aspects of culture, or they might appreciate other aspects of culture. And so again, culture is shared here. It is socially learned. It is knowledge-based, with a lot of insider knowledge not really known to outsiders who aren't really embedded within that culture. And then last to note, is shown through patterns of behaviors like rights, roles, duties. Um, I pulled this quote from my Intro to Sociology textbook, and I like it. And it asks, uh, and it says it refers to that particular textbook refers to a culture within us, where sociologists say that there's a culture within us. So take some time, reflect upon this, and kind of think about how is there a culture within you? What does that culture look like? How do you express your culture? What does it even mean when sociologists say there's a culture within us? So take some time, reflect upon that question. And if you're in my anthropology class, because I'm making this video, I'm discussing culture with both my intro to sociology and anthropology class. So if you're in my anthropology class, put that reflection into your field journal. And then I have another quote here from my Intro to Sociology textbook, and it says, culture becomes the lens through which we perceive and evaluate what is going on around us. And so for anthropologists and sociologists, mostly sociologists here, they really view culture as a lens where, for example, where we put on our cultural glasses, right, to see stuff around us. And it helps us to maneuver our world or our society or our little neighborhood, right, a particular way. Ethnocentrism is an important term for for anthropologists here. Ethnocentrism is a tendency to use our own group's ways of doing things as a yardstick for judging others. Stated differently, you might see people centering their own beliefs as the universal belief, right? While not recognizing or even judging others' beliefs and cultures. That is in reference to ethnocentrism, or centering your own beliefs over other people's. An example of this would be beauty standards. This is just one example of what you might see. Another one would be language, right? Considering one language as the dominant language over others, and kind of having that language dominate certain regions or certain spaces, where only people can speak that specific language over other languages. And it doesn't allow for people who are multilingual or people who speak other languages to speak their native tongues in a particular setting. And they might even be isolated or discriminated against when they choose to speak their native tongue or native language. But beauty standards, going back to beauty standards, we have seen, historically speaking, particular cultures develop a beauty standard that sort of states that this particular beauty standard is more valid, more dominant than other beauty standards. And even they have labeled particular people and groups of people as more beautiful than other groups of people. A straightforward example of this that we have seen is Nazi Germany with establishing their own beauty standard. And this is an example of ethnocentrism here, of establishing that blonde-haired, blue-eyed people are the dominant race and beautiful over other races. That is an example of beauty standards here and how it ties into ethnocentrism. That's not the only example. We have also seen this with comparison of hair and hair types, where curly hair is labeled as, especially Black women's curly hair, is labeled as messy or drabby or anything of the like, with very discriminatory terms attached to that type of hairstyle, versus straighter hair is seen as cleaner or nicer, right? That is an example of ethnocentrism here, establishing certain beauty standards that kind of seep into our cultural standards of beauty. I hope that makes sense. Values, norms, and sanctions are very important within the realm of culture. Sorry, I'm trying to get situated in my seat. Values are essentially the ideas of what is desirable in life, while norms describe those expectations, rules that develop out of a group's values. Sanctions refers to the reactions people receive for following or breaking norms. And positive and negative sanctions. So positive sanctions are essentially a positive reaction to you doing something right within a particular culture, you following a specific norm or a value a correct way. Versus a negative sanction is you breaking a norm within a society and culture. And the reaction to that breaking of the norm. So, for example, and I use this with all of my classes when I talk about culture and sanctions, but a positive sanction here would be, for example, you doing a good job on an essay that you have for my class, right? Or you doing a good job on an assignment that you have for my class, and I give you a good grade. That is an example of a positive sanction here. A negative sanction is you doing a poor job on an assignment or that I assign you, or an essay that I assign you, and I give you a bad grade, an F, for that assignment. That is an example of a negative sanction because it signifies to you that you did something wrong, or you did something right if you received a good grade. Other examples of this would be you following the law and you don't get arrested. That is a positive sanction versus you speeding, getting pulled over and receiving a ticket. That is a negative sanction. There are different parts of symbolic culture. It's not just symbols here. It's not just gestures. It's not just language. It's not just, it's a whole, it includes behaviors. It includes sanctions. It includes positive and negative sanctions. It includes norms and beliefs and the like here. So it's not just symbols, gestures, and language that are part of symbolic culture. But nonetheless, symbols, gestures, and language are pretty important to symbolic culture. So, symbol or a symbol is something to which people attach meaning and that they use to communicate with one another. In this way, symbols can be a variety of different things. A symbol could be a symbol that is attached to, again, a school that you're a part of, or you're taking a class from, like Cloud County. A symbol can also be something where you look at it and you recognize something, right? A particular religion could have a symbol attached to it, often does have a symbol attached to it. Or sometimes certain branding, like Nike, has a symbol where you look at that particular symbol and you think of Nike. Versus gestures. Gestures are movements of the body to communicate with others, shorthand ways to convey a message. Gestures can be, like I commonly talk with my hands, and that's the gestures that I do. But there are other gestures here. There's eye contact, there is like pointing, there is different hand gestures that you could do. There is body language, right? The way that you move your body could become a gesture, right? And it's a way that we might communicate whether or not we like a person or we don't like a person. Whether or not we understand something, we would maybe nod our heads or shake our heads if we don't understand something. So again, it's the way that we convey a message through the movement of our body. Language are symbols, which is a funky way of thinking about language, but it's true. When you're looking at a particular letter, for example, like A, you recognize that as an A because it's a symbol. It represents something and how it holds meaning. And further, you form a word through that A. You know how to say A from saying an A. So language are symbols that can be combined in an infinite number of ways for the purpose of communicating abstract thought. And it's how we get written down or verbalized messages to other people. It's also what makes us as humans very, very unique to non-humans that don't really have the speech patterns that we do. And they further, non-human animals, more importantly, they might be able to verbalize something, right, uh, through squeaking or barking, right? But there's no real meaning behind that bark. As opposed to our words, we know the context behind the words that we use because we've learned it, we've picked up on it. It's what makes us unique. Um, so language here allows culture to develop by freeing people to move beyond their immediate experiences, which is a quote that I pulled from an Intro to Sociology textbook that I like. So, um, there are different parts of cultural worlds here. You have the main culture, which I wonder if I could bring up different tools here. Maybe not. Sure could. I want to draw it out for you. That's what I want to do. Okay, so if I had a whiteboard behind me, I would be drawing on a whiteboard, but I don't. So you have the main culture within a given society, right? And that main culture will follow particular values, norms, patterns of behaviors, etc. And then you have a subculture and a counterculture. The culture kind of dominates over the rest of everything else, right? It dominates over subcultures and countercultures here. But this is an important visual. Subcultures are oftentimes found within the main culture, and they're kind of like little pockets of subcultures found within the main culture. They don't they don't fully follow all the values here. They kind of separate themselves from that, but they for the most part follow the values of the main culture. They kind of again separate themselves and form little cliques, but they still follow those kind of core values that are part of a culture. Versus countercultures completely disagree with the main culture here. And they are not they don't they just they not only disagree with it, but they're at odds with the main culture. Something about the main culture they do not agree with. Or they agree completely. They don't agree completely with the main culture, like every form of it. It might be a little part of that culture, or it might be the whole thing that they don't agree with, in other words. So subcultures are groups of people who occupy some small corner in life, such as an occupation. They tend to develop specialized ways of communicating with one another as well within subcultures. And so, an example of it, I should have brought down the book, but An example of it is the book Outsiders, which is the book that you're probably thinking of. It's a book by Howard Becker, who is a very famous criminologist and sociologist. And he was studying drug culture. And drug culture is a particular subculture, right? Especially he was studying people who smoke weed and marijuana and who formed their own subculture. And from this, he found that they communicated a particular way within the subculture. They had particular lingo or language that they would use. And they had different terms for particular items or processes, right? Taking a drag or a doobie, right? They had particular terms that they had attached meaning to, and that formed out of this particular subculture. It's furthermore how they communicated with one another. What's also important here is that within a subculture like the weed culture that Howard Becker studied, is that you were seeing those individuals learn from other people that were part of that subculture. They were in the process of, for example, smoking weed. They were learning how to take a drag, what it looked like, how to take the best intake in for the smoke, and how to get the best high, in other words, from other members within that subculture. That was the key point of his research here, and how people communicate effectively with each other and learn the culture through other people. What it's also highlighting here is that the weed culture that he studies within this book was different from the dominant culture, where the dominant culture, for the most part, did not agree with the smoking of marijuana or weed and considered it illegal, right? And so somewhat at odds, not completely at odds, like counterculture here, but again, they were somewhat at odds with the main culture and their views on drug usage. It's just one example of subcultures. Countercultures refers to a group of people whose values and norms are completely at odds with the dominant culture, completely at odds. And so, before I get into my examples, what would be, take some time, reflect upon this definition, and think about it. What would be some examples of countercultures here? What are some examples of subcultures? How do you distinguish between these two definitions and terms? Are you confused by these two definitions? But some examples of counterculture here would be, for example, a terrorist group who is completely at odds with the main culture, so much so that they would commit violent acts towards that main culture. Or you have anarchist groups that are at odds with the dominant culture. You have technically goths might be considered countercultural here because they are at odds with the main culture. Just to name a few examples here. But goth is also a subculture, so it gets tricky with trying to figure out where people fall within specific cultures and how at odds they are with the main culture. Oh, I don't know where I went. Where did I go? That's where I went. This is a good place to stop. For now, I'll continue this discussion on culture with the next video, just to kind of break it up and give you a break between them. So I'll see you with the next video that I post.